As we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about how this session got started and how it evolved and how we want to run it. I was what got me going on this was a couple of years ago, I went to the National Society of Architectural Historians meeting, which was held in Chicago. And they had one session on preservation. I was the only person from California attending that session, and it turned out to be a knockdown, a slam down fight between the Real Estate Board of the City of New York and the Landmarks Commission in the City of New York. And this was a session put on by the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And the premise of the entire session was that preservation in New York had become so successful that it was going to be impossible to build anything ever again in the city of New York. And as a result of preservation's success, which we heard a lot about in the plenary session, affordable housing was a thing of the past. So the answer that there were all sorts of maps and charts and diagrams and whatever to prove that preservation was a terrible thing. It was freezing the city in time and was preventing new development. So this, of course, presented a very lively conversation. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was maybe just New York. I later started picking up this topic elsewhere. Last summer, there were several articles on National Public Radio about this in Chicago, in Boulder. They were interviewing people here in Los Angeles. And I thought, sounds like an interesting topic. So I started wondering, what's the deal here? Is preservation really a problem? From my perspective, being a preservationist for the last 30 or so years, preservation is doing exactly what it was intended to do, which was to be an alternative to wholesale redevelopment, which was the scrape and clear model. Preservation was developed to be as an alternative. So the intent was, rather than renewing the city with wholesale destruction and renewal, rebuilding, you would do it in a more gentle manner, rehabilitating, adaptively reusing existing building stock. And that in itself would help economically and socially, culturally revitalize the city without major dislocations. So the question is, looks like preservation has succeeded, or at least there are enough people who think we have succeeded to make this an issue. So my question is it really an issue? I've assembled a panel of experts here from various august institutions in the Los Angeles area who have used Los Angeles as their laboratory in looking at these various issues. So I'd like to introduce our panel to you. Sitting immediately to my left here is Professor Denise Lawrence. She is at Cal Poly Pomona as a socio-cultural anthropologist. She teaches in the area of behavioral factors, focusing on socio-cultural aspects of vernacular and modern housing, historic preservation, and resource consumption. She's conducted research all over the place, but the main reason that we've got her on this panel is she's been focusing on various cities in the San Gabriel Valley that have undergone gentrification from Asian immigrants. And this is creating a rather interesting cultural dynamic in the eastern San Gabriel Valley. Her most recent book is entitled Protecting Suburban America, Gentrification, Advocacy, and the Historic Imaginary. And we'll learn a little bit more about what her research has shown as we continue. To her left is Professor Juliana Delgado. She is the co-director of the California Center for Land and Water Stewardship at Cal Poly Pomona. A practicing planner and architect, has done a tremendous number. She's done a lot of field work and is also an expert in film history, using the urban environment as it is shown in film.
Can I add one?
Yes, please do.
I think what's probably the most relevant for you, the reason I'm on this panel, is that I served for many years as the president of the Bungalow Neighborhood Association.
I was getting to that.
Oh,
yes.
I thought you were finished.
No, I'm not finished.
I'm sorry.
Yes, this is Madam President. She's also written the book on Bungalow Heaven from Arcadia Press and has all of the history of that neighborhood, and has been a major force here in Pasadena, serving on a number of commissions looking at the redevelopment of the city. So she's a practicing professional as well as a scholar. To her left is Anastasia Lucato-Sedaris from UCLA. She is professor of urban planning and the associate provost for academic planning at UCLA in the urban and regional planning program, and is an expert in transportation, among other things, and has done a lot of studies looking at the nexus between urban revitalization and transportation. She has served as a consultant to the Transportation Research Board, the Federal Highway Administration, Southern California Association of Governments, South Bay Cities Council of Government, Los Angeles Neighborhood Initiative, Project for Public Spaces, and the Greek government, as well as many other municipal governments. And we have her here on this panel because she's been doing a lot of research on the nexus between mass transit, particularly, and gentrification and gentrification. And last but certainly not least is Professor Jan Lin, who is a professor of sociology at Occidental College. He has been doing a lot of research in the eastern San Gabriel Valley, again, looking at the various diverse communities, everything from Chinatown. He's the author of a publication called Reconstructing Chinatown, Ethnic Enclave and Global Change, and the co-editor of the Urban Sociology Reader and the Power of Urban Ethnic Places. So he is our diversity expert on this panel. So we have a sociologist, a transportation planner, an urban planner, an architect, and an anthropologist who have all looked at various communities here across the Los Angeles basin to study gentrification and to give us some insight into what's really going on. How does preservation factor into that social movement? So I'm going to start off with a definition here. Professor Lin, can you give us some insight on what gentrification is?
Okay, so gentrification is a term that is popularly attributed to the British geographer Ruth Glass in her studies of the central London district of Islington in the early 1960s, describing a residential transition process where middle-class newcomers were displacing working-class established residents. The term applied to the US subsequently acquired more the idea of racial ethnic succession. You can see racial ethnic succession in Los Angeles in neighborhoods like that are gentrifying in neighborhoods like Venice, Baldwin Hills, Boyle Heights, Northeast Los Angeles, Chinatown, and Little Tokyo, right? Gentrification is something that, a term that rose to describe the residential transition process, but I think it's increasingly applied to the commercial transition process also. And finally, I've been very interested in a so-called stage model or stage theory of gentrification, which originated with American urbanists in the late 1970s. They were looking at the idea that there's a revitalization or preservation stage whereby pioneers first in the inner city are subsequently then later displaced by more affluent gentrifiers. And their research took place in both East Coast cities and also San Francisco. But then another set of British geographers, Loretta Lees and others, now they're comparing neighborhoods like Barnbury in London, Brooklyn in New York, and renewing the idea of the stage model of the stage theory.
What would a stage model consist of?
So the stage model would consist of the idea that, well, primarily they might look at, there's this idea that there might be up anywhere from 2 to 4 stages, but that the pioneers would typically go into a neighborhood that might be seen as a risky investment, but through sweat equity and interest in the particular architecture of that area, make their own investments, that it would be more supply side, or sorry, demand side in the beginning, with small capital investments, not necessarily with a lot of government stimulation, but that a little bit later, in the later periods, now some people write about the later stages as encompassing more of the supply side, and that government or larger corporate investors might be more involved in the later periods. and that actually displacement is more common in the later periods, because in the early periods, you've really got pioneers and artists mixing with the established working class residents. Among the displaced then would be the working class residents, and I think there's commonly a reference to longtime established seniors, which you see in some of the ethnic communities also.
Thank you. Professor Delgado, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I guess I could just give you sort of a textbook definition. And actually, if you're curious about the derivation of the word gentrification, it comes from a British sociologist. So therefore, gentry, the upper classes, areas that are going to be of more appeal to sort of higher socioeconomic classes than the people that are currently in an area. But I called it the restoration, redevelopment, or rebuilding of a deteriorated neighborhood, resulting in a rise in property values. So there is a supply side and demand side economic factor in this. The moving in of middle or upper income residents and the displacement of long-time, possibly working class or lower income residents, as well as an associated loss to the history and character of the area. So part of it is not just the change in the physical makeup of a neighborhood, but the long-term character, and that's what we're concerned about, especially the ethnic and historical part of it. So I would add that. So you can see in the United States, there's been a lot of change in a number of neighborhoods. If you think about parts of Manhattan where different socioeconomic groups have occupied different parts of the city, and the buildings seem to stay, but the residents change and the character changes. Here in Los Angeles, Boyle Heights is a really good example, from being a Russian Jewish immigrant neighborhood to becoming Latino. So we have this kind of ebb and flow of places for a lot of factors, which we're going to get into a little bit later, why we have gentrification. But the buildings seem to stay, but the people are changing, and the character and how they're used and how they're perceived, and then their whole cosmology, that idea of cultural displacement comes into effect as well.
As you can see, that the concept of gentrification is multifaceted. And Anastasia, you've done a lot of work on some of the other factors other than just preservation. And I think what we're looking at here is primarily districts, where you're setting aside maybe a multi-block area of the city. And as our plenary session speaker noted, you're sort of freezing it in time and trying to both lock the physical characteristics and maybe the economic characteristics in place. Now, as we've seen, it doesn't work for the socio-cultural characteristics, those shift, and with those groups, the economics also shift. So we're looking at something within a defined area, but there's space around that area that also has various factors that can influence what's going on there. And you've studied a lot of those. Would you like to share that with our audience?
I want to add a few more things to, I think my colleagues here gave some good definitions. Well, at its most simple level, gentrification is a form of neighborhood change. But what we see happening and interacting are three processes. We often see movement of people in the neighborhood, but oftentimes out of the neighborhood, and that's what we call displacement. And frankly, this is the most problematic aspect of the process. We also see flows of capital, private investments, and we also see oftentimes public investments. And quite often, people think that gentrification is always caused by the market, and that's oftentimes true. But gentrification can be caused by public investments. I really looked into, for example, a transit station. Neighborhoods, we had a very detailed study. We found that neighborhoods with transit stations are more likely to gentrify than neighborhoods with no transit stations. Doesn't mean that every transit neighborhood is going to gentrify. It has to do with which neighborhood is more vulnerable. Or if you have a big park, public investment, it can also trigger gentrification. I also want to add that, as we heard, we have residential gentrification, we have commercial gentrification, which is less studied, and people in community groups have started talking also about cultural gentrification. This idea that something is lost in your neighborhood because of its culture, because of the change of people, and the neighborhood doesn't look anymore as it looked for the last 20 years. And I guess lastly, the one thing I want to add is there is also the term exclusionary gentrification, and that's when most people feel that gentrification is when, and its displacement is when people are forced out of the neighborhood because others who are more privileged, wealthier, can afford the higher prices. But exclusionary displacement, gentrification, is when people cannot afford to move into a neighborhood that is gentrified. And that's also a matter of concern. So I think, that I just wanted to add some of these to everything else that was said that was very true.
So we've talked a little bit about displacement and gentrification in general. What's preservation's role in all of this? Jan, again, do you want to start off with some of the factors that might make preservation a culprit in this dynamic?
Yeah, so I think that when we think about preservation, that the first studies of gentrification were really on how certain white returnees to the inner city after a period of white flight were interested in particular types of building stock, and that they were putting sweat equity and they were pioneering in these areas, and they were tolerant to risk. There wasn't a whole lot of consistent belief that these were necessarily good investment environments. And I have a colleague that was looking actually at artists and bohemians and gay and lesbian pioneers. Those weren't the only kinds of pioneers. If I could just put a plug for my forthcoming book, Taking Back the Boulevard, Art, Activism, and Gentrification in Northeast LA. But this idea that not just artists, but the preservationists are involved, and that these preservationists, that what they have done is they've made certain gentrification districts around the country sort of known as signatory or iconic districts. The idea of loft living in Soho, New York, the Brooklyn brownstone, the San Francisco Victorian home, and the loft living in the .com districts of the Mission. And that what's interesting now is that Los Angeles, that we have Bungalow, Heaven, the arts and crafts districts now emerging into greater public consciousness. That speaks to something about gentrification's and preservation's somewhat later timing. Maybe in Los Angeles, we were sprawling for a longer time. That I've been looking more recently for the last several years, research in Northeast Los Angeles, and I've been very interested that there were these so-called slow growth movements in the 1980s in Eagle Rock and Highland Park, where residents were really irate about mini malls and condominiums and even chain stores moving into their communities. And they were very concerned about preserving not only their residential, but their commercial building stock there. And that through all of their work, they were able to, in Eagle Rock, create a Colorado Boulevard specific plan that would regulate the permitting process, and in Highland Park, a Highland Park overlay zone, where there they would have citizens review boards overlooking and approving demolition, so even stronger and earlier in the process. And so I think that what happened is they achieved revitalization, they achieved preservation, and these districts are known as proponents for quality of life. And in some ways, we could say that gentrification is sort of an unintended consequence of what they were seeking to mobilize in their communities.
Thank you. Professor Delgado, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'll move this up. Yeah, I wanted to sort of give you a little bit of a case study, if I can, talk about my neighborhood, because it's, how many of you were on the Bungalow Heaven home tour? Did anybody attend that? So you got to see it. Well, Bungalow Heaven is the supposedly the largest collection of intact working class houses from the period of about 1890 to the late 20s. It's a period of significance. Didn't start out that way. It started out from simple in an economic, that part of that supply side, demand side economics. Pasadena in the mid 70s had deteriorated. We had air pollution here you couldn't see across the street. It wasn't very desirable. People were moving out, larger, wealthier people were living in certain parts of Pasadena, but a lot of middle-class families were moving out to the San Fernando Valley into larger tract houses. So there was that period of transition where people were moving out and Pasadena wasn't very desirable. Now, also in that era, the 210 freeway cut Pasadena in half. We never had the 210 before that era. So the neighborhoods on the north side of the 210 became much less desirable than the southern part of the city in some areas. I'm kind of generalizing. But what happened was a number of people in my neighborhood, it's the northeast part of Pasadena, they were looking for homes that they could afford, first of all, and that weren't cookie cutter. They didn't want to live in tracts. And a couple of the pioneers that Professor Lynn alluded to came into the neighborhood and they found these deteriorated properties. They were old homes, the latest being in the 1920s, and they could buy them fairly inexpensively, and they started fixing them up. So they became more desirable. So over a 25-year lifespan of bungalow heaven, what happened was in the late 1980s, a couple of the bungalows were taken down and very ugly, and I'm not being, it's not really a value judgment. They're very ugly apartment buildings were put up that were stucco, the kind, that have parking underneath them with pillars. You know that type of dingbats, right? So there was one that came down near the elementary school, and that was enough for the folks that were moving in to mobilize and start a petition drive to change the zoning. And they went to the city council. Once they got 55% of the property owners to sign the petition, it's a mile square area. They went to the city council and they created the first landmark district. So preservation helped them helped them keep their small homes and stop the increase and stop the destruction of those homes. But it took a very long time for the neighborhood to gentrify. And yes, it has gentrified. So over a 25-year lifespan, we bought our house in 2002, and my husband always jokes and says, the gate came down, we could never buy our house again, which is true. A lot of the longtime residents are still there, but we would joke also, who can afford to buy a house in bungalow heaven? We'd say 2 anesthesiologists. That's it. It was no longer the teachers and the retired people from the Midwest who created those homes to begin with. So there's been that change. And did it gentrify? Yes. Was historic preservation the cause of gentrification? That's a bigger question that we can talk about. But the result has been that the properties now, because it's a landmark district and because it's now on the National Register, the property values are about 15% higher than surrounding streets. And also there was a loss of about 80 rental units. So there's a significant change in who's living there and who can afford to live there. So just wanted to give you a case study.
And thank you very much. You mentioned a couple of externalities here that affected the way the district went. And first was the imposition of the freeway and all of the upset that occurs when you strip out several blocks and kind of create a barrier between one side of the community and the other. The other was the air pollution, which affected everybody in that section of the San Gabriel Valley. So those were 2 external factors that the district had no control over whatsoever. Now, Anastasia, you've done some research in historic districts all over the LA area. And what we tend to, some of the research that we preservationists tend to share with others when they're skeptical about why would I want my house regulated as part of the district, it's going to make my property values go down. We tend to cite all those really whiz-bang studies from the East Coast that says, no, they go up. Well, the the answer is a little bit more nuanced than that. And Anastasia, you've done a lot of research on that in the LA area. Would you like to
Sure.
share it with us?
Actually, I want to share with you the findings of a doctoral student of mine that she really looked into all 29 HPOZ zones in Los Angeles, the historic preservation occupancy zones, the effect of the designation, if they gentrified or not. And she did find a mixed bag. Some did not. And it comes down, it is coming back to Diane, to your original question, if historic preservation causes gentrification. Historic preservation can intensify gentrification, but it has to do with how vulnerable a neighborhood is. So it is really neighborhood vulnerability that may make a neighborhood gentrify. And what we mean by vulnerable is it's sociodemographics, the percentage of renters. If it is a neighborhood that is mostly renters, it is much easier for, it's much more vulnerable. If the average household incomes are below the county average, or quite below the county average, and also certain locational characteristics. So definitely, it's aesthetics, it's housing stock, locational characteristics, how close it is to employment centers or areas where people want to live. So what we find is that looking into these historic preservation districts, those that were vulnerable, those were the ones that gentrified. So the response is much more nuanced. We cannot say that historic preservation causes gentrification. We really have to look into the context and some of the internal factors, the external factors, to see why some neighborhoods are gentrifying and why they're not. And only one other thing that I wanted to share with you, because we will, and you can go to Google displacement project, you will find all the maps for the Los Angeles area, which neighborhoods have gentrified in 1990, 2000, etc. What I wanted to say that, well, I thought about giving you the, forgot my argument, but it will come back to me. Sorry, but do Google that if you're interested in seeing, it came back. I wanted to say that we looked into all the census tracts, and the percentage of neighborhoods that have gentrified is close to a little bit less than 10%. So it is not a huge number, of course, for people that see their neighborhoods gentrifying. And also coming back to what you said about the stages of gentrification. There are neighborhoods that are in very early stages of gentrification that the census tract information doesn't even know yet about. But if you ask the people who live there, they will tell you, this building came in, we have a Starbucks, a yoga studio opened in the area, and these will be registered in the census some years later. So this 10% may be a very conservative estimate, but
well, we've talked about two aspects of gentrification that are negatives. The positive is property values do tend to go up, and they tend to go up faster than the surrounding areas if the neighborhood is vulnerable to gentrification. But there are negatives, and the two negatives we've identified so far are cultural displacement and the economic displacement of people who are renting and cannot afford to buy property. So this plays into the wider topics that is hot within the state right now, which is the affordability crisis in housing. So we're starting to see statewide issues that have bubbled up to the governor's office, to where they are now kind of forcing ways to increase the affordable housing stock in various localities around the state. And this is something everybody is going to be involved with as we go forward. What I'd like to do before we start looking at some of the physical characteristics, let's talk about cultural displacement and get Professor Lawrence in the mix here. You've done a lot of studies of cultural displacement, only some of the stuff that you've looked at is going the other way. Rather than having, you're having wealthy people come in, but a lot of people from abroad who have very different cultures and cultural values and lifestyles that are creating a lot of displacement in the communities they're entering. Can you share some of that with us?
My study that I did of historic preservation in the San Gabriel Valley included the cities of Pasadena, Monrovia, Ontario, Riverside, and Alhambra. In 2 cases, Pasadena and Monrovia, I found historic preservation to be associated with gentrification. And it confirms a lot of the observations that Anastasia spoke of. In both Ontario and Riverside, at least in the communities that I looked at, there was no gentrification to speak of. The people who reluctantly agreed to have districts established for them used it as a way to reinforce their elite status in the city. And they initially were very resistant about it. So it plays historic preservation laws and regulations play different roles in different communities. And in the case of Alhambra, which has no historic preservation legislation, but does have a very active citywide group, they have adopted residential design guidelines as a kind of interim measure. I don't know if they'll ever get historic preservation legislation. And in that particular community, one of the things that they're confronted with is this very large influx of Chinese immigrants who have very different expectations about what a home should look like. And if any of you are familiar with what goes on in not Sierra Madre, Arcadia, which is sort of the notorious one, but also in parts of San Gabriel, San Marino. Now, San Marino is a city of mansions, let me just point out, and the immigrants want to build mansions. So this doesn't seem to be a big conflict. You see them tearing the old ones down and building new ones up. But in Arcadia, probably you have some of the most radical changes to a neighborhood, which can go from very small, even stucco tract houses, to houses that occupy the entire block or the lot. And that was the issue and continues to be the issue in Alhambra. So in Alhambra, the way in which new houses get built or old ones get remodeled is to take a proposal to the design review board. And the design review board, now with this new set of design guidelines, can adjudicate the issue. And part of the problem or the challenge has been that many of the people making the proposals don't really understand why a house that has some kind of traditional, or we would say historic features, needs to be enhanced for those features and can't be, let's just say, stuccoed over. So my study has been, a lot of the work that I've been doing is looking at that kind of the way in which historic preservation laws and regulations operate to discriminate against people's taste, why they are turned down and may not understand what they did wrong. And in that way, it's an exclusionary practice because in my mind, the cultural displacement is about the morality of home. The home is a moral model of what you aspire to have, what you feel comfortable in. If you move from another country to the United States, you may want to construct that moral model. And one of the things that happens in neighborhoods that have historic preservation organizations like Bungalow Heaven, they hold home tours. And the purpose, aside from giving people things to do, the purpose in my mind is to represent and promote the restoration of old houses as a moral model of how one should live in these old houses. And the conflicts that occur in various cities around those kinds of desires of newcomers to remodel their houses or even tear them down and build mansions. When you have that kind of conflict, it's a way of excluding and even shaming them for having such values and aesthetic preferences. So this is occurring. We don't necessarily see it in statistics. We don't necessarily see it, but it's an experience of place that speaks to the morality. And if I can just add one more thing, I think part of the problem with people who become advocates for preservation is that they think their aesthetic preferences are morally superior. And therein lies part of the problem. And this is sort of an issue in many different cities about who is right, who has the right to tell me, you know, how my house should look. So it's a source of deep controversy.
Sure.
Part of that too is you have to go to the next higher level. So in the Secretary of Interior standards, it's sort of prescriptive what you're supposed to do to a house when it's historically designated. So those changes in that whole concept of what historic preservation is, you know, goes up to a higher kind of federal level. So then it has a trickle down kind of effect in neighborhoods where there is an imposed way of, you know, what the architecture is supposed to be. And houses are living things. Even, you know, even the most pristine bungalows that were built in the, you know, the early, you know, 1910, they had different models where you could get a 3-bedroom or a 5-bedroom or a 2, and people would, you know, their families would grow and change, and there would be growth and change. But somehow, the way we've defined historic preservation, there's a stop in time, and this is what it's supposed to be. And that's where the conflict is, because when people change, lives change. One thing I always think is very interesting in my neighborhood is that people are so, you know, you have these like die-hard preservationists where everything has to be, you know, exactly how the house was in 1910, except they don't, you know, they want a modern kitchen, right? And they want, you know, good German plumbing, you know, they want good fixtures, and they want, so, you know, there's lines here, but that what Denise is alluding to is that, you know, this works on a national level where we're dictating, you know, what this freezing in time and what that means to people that are new, that are coming in, and they're buying their home, and a home is a very precious thing. So.
Professor Lynn, you've done a lot of research on cultural issues in East LA, and I think there's some strategies that the communities have come up with to give them more leverage in their homes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So with reference to East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights, I think what's interesting to even further complicate the idea of who's being displaced is that there's that term gentrification that's come out the last 2 or 3 years applied to Boyle Heights, right? That's addressing when middle-class Latinos who may have been moved further out in the city are returning to the central city, and it's been applied directly to Boyle Heights. Sure, some of them are involved with opening up new art galleries, with new businesses, I think that the literature there, you know, and the reporting is that some see those gentrifiers, you know, gente means people. There's no particular class kind of insinuation there. But, you know, some people think, well, as a gentrifier, that if I'm Latino and I'm investing in the central city, perhaps I can achieve a different model, you know, and I think about the community. It might be a community I'm returning to. I think there's some others that suggest, well, it's still a class upgrading. So whether it's gentrification, it's still gentrification. And so I think it gets very complicated. And when thinking about cross-ethnic and cross-racial elements and how that crosscuts class. And with reference back to the Asian phenomena, yeah, that's very interesting that starting back in the late 70s, you had the Chinese investment happening in Monterey Park, which at that time was being advertised by the developer Frederick Shea as the Chinese Beverly Hills, and that there was a slow growth movement and movement against climate, and that there was legislation passed that wasn't quite an ordinance, but it created a greater review for investment projects that were going to actually change the zoning. And so what effectively happened there, I've been very interested in, is, you look at the San Gabriel Valley, and rather than one city, you've got all these competing suburban, what I would call sort of more middle ring suburbs, because they weren't streetcar suburbs that were the first inner ring. That middle ring was that sort of post-war automobile commuter suburb, right? And that in competing off with each other, the Chinese immigrants just started moving further east, and that now Arcadia is being called the Chinese Beverly Hills. But that, I think that really, what's happened though, is that you have Chinese leaders, you have Anglo leaders that will work in various ways with the growth machinery and the growth coalitions. And that in some cases in Alhambra and San Gabriel, I've seen that city managers have been able to achieve a certain amount of sort of compromise in design and planning. But in other instances, such as my park in Arcadia, it's just a very incendiary situation. And in Arcadia, they had a recall campaign, lawsuits, especially after in Arcadia, the mansionization started in Lower Arcadia. And then when it moved into the Highlands, it got much more contentious. And so I think that the research that Denise is doing is so interesting, because she even makes comparisons further east to the San Gabriel Valley.
So we've been talking about cultural friction, cultural displacement, cultural flux. I think, Jan, you've also done some work on neighborhood organizations, and what Juliana's alluded to this. I mean, some of this stuff is political, some of it's economic. We've been talking about externalities, but there's been some citizen efforts that have assisted with keeping, keeping neighborhoods livable for the occupants, and sort of allowing them to set down roots when it looks like they're being under threat from outside forces. Anybody want to talk about some of those strategies that have been used?
Talk about like the causes of gentrification, or?
They've done that. Do you have more to add?
Kind of. Well, it's sort of, your original question was, is historic preservation, does it cause gentrification? Well, that's one of those questions that are it's an it depends kind of an answer, because we're dealing with gentrification as a symptom of a lot of social problems. It's not a force of it. It's not the cause, it's the effect. So if you think of all the social problems, the social environmental problems that we have that make this very complex web of our, in our lives and our communities, it's a result of them. For example, I always think the basis of everything is overpopulation. If we had a quarter of the people, we wouldn't even be here talking about this, okay? So you have population, you have racism, you have displacement, you have jobs that are leaving, and you have this ebb and flow of areas because of all of these factors. So it's not that that historic preservation in itself, because you're restoring a house, that it's going to be gentrified. It's all of those things. You have to take into consideration the vulnerability of the neighborhood, whether there are jobs close by, whether it's attractive because of those things, and where it is in its sort of economic life. In areas are popular and they become unpopular, and that changes all over the country all the time. It's a dynamic economic process where, depending on what's available, and that supply side and demand side, where there's enough housing because there's enough jobs. So it's not just historic preservation. Gentrification is a very complicated complex kind of a social, what we call a wicked problem, and it's a symptom of all of those kinds of issues.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Anastasia. Well, let me throw one other wrinkle in here. There was an article that came out in the New York Times yesterday or 2 days ago, talking about the mortgage income deduction from your federal taxes, and how this has been a silent government subsidy to homeowners, and it has allowed people who own homes to amass wealth that they can then pass down through generations, whereas people who are renters don't have that social boost from the federal government. And the comment in the article was, well, this is a benefit that everybody takes for granted, so nobody questions it, and they haven't looked at the policy implications of how we spend our tax dollars, who gets the breaks and who doesn't, and what that says about our interest as a culture in determining what's important. So we basically have determined by giving people a tax break for home ownership that is an important value. However, it tends to reward people who already have money. And if you look at our current president, who has made his job in property development and has basically boasted that he's paid no taxes as a result of some of his real estate deals, that sort of gives you the larger picture of what as a culture we have done, which then plays into this wicked problem that we're basically locking in poverty for those individuals who do not have the opportunity to amass enough money to get into a home. Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah.
So I want to say, I mean, federal policy, housing. And when you talk about gentrification, I want to say, I really want to turn the discussion to display, because it is display about, not gentrification. It is most vulnerable neighborhoods are neighborhoods of renters. And now, even ironically, when the US policy has favored homeowners, we have less than 50% of homeownership, and the younger generation, it is not only the low income people, our kids cannot afford to buy, and we have an increasing number of people who are renters. And these are the groups that are more being replaced. And I think we should do a social preservation of keeping the neighborhoods intact, not only physical preservation. And then, I mean, the good news is there are policies, and why I'm interested in, there are things that you can do to minimize the effects of displacement. I would say very broad, there are 3 broad categories of. There are policies that try to build more affordable housing. They can range, I have a whole list, but I have time to go through all of them. We do? Okay. You can have affordable housing impact fees. So when developers build, you can ask them to give a percentage of their units into affordable housing, or to give a fee, what's called in lieu of fee, to the city to build affordable housing. You can have trust funds. You can have community benefits agreements, like we had one in Staples Center, where a big development is being developed. There is negotiation about what this development can give back to the community in terms of jobs, in terms of housing, etc. You can have inclusionary zoning. You can have reduced parking requirements. You can have accessory dwelling units, like the granny flats that some cities started allowing them. So this is housing production, affordable housing production. The second big category is to preserve existing strategies that preserve existing affordable housing. And these have to do with rent stabilization and rent control. Ordinances that condominium conversion ordinances that should be much stricter. No net loss, 1-for-1 replacement strategies, and so on and so forth. And lastly, tenant protection and support strategies, rental assistance, tenant counseling, proactive code enforcement, just cause eviction policies, tenant right to purchase laws. All these are protecting tenants. And last but not least, because Diane, you asked about that, is what is the role of community groups? And I would say that we found in our studies that it is a big role to play. So in areas where there are CBOs, community-based organizations, that are very vigilant and active and get into the process, into the planning process, and get a voice in the table when the new plans are being created, we have found the Thai CDC is one example where they really negotiated more affordable housing around the station area. And so we find that it does make a difference when you have active groups.
To add about strategies to,
Yeah, I guess I would add that in the neighborhoods I've been looking at in Northeast Los Angeles, I mean, these residents have been organizing the last 2 years. They've been on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Yeah, I started in the East Coast. And so that Northeast Los Angeles Alliance really speaks to how, yeah, you know, these residents respond, and they're responding to that later period of displacement that, you know, gentrification really ratcheted up after the recession. And so the kinds of issues that they promote are, you know, maximal public participation in the public hearing process, in the planning charrette process, that whenever that there is government stimulation of new housing, like these transit villages that we have in the transit-oriented development zones, that there was a transit village plan for Highland Park. And, you know, they were, that the community, whether they're the, some of these neighborhood activists or the community-based organizations, cry for linkage programs where, so long as there's incentivizing where they're taking public parking lots and making them available to developers at, you know, with tax incentives, they don't feel that they're actually getting real affordable housing set aside. And that it really takes that participation and that it's whether the public officials can open up channels for that participation or the organizations themselves produce the channels. They even use the CEQA, the Comprehensive Environmental, the California Environmental Quality Act. And, you know, you've got these activist, you know, pro bono lawyers, sometimes not pro bono, sometimes they're hired in Hollywood by developers against each other, sure. But many times they'll act pro bono for these neighborhood activist groups. And in this case, they were able to block the transit village. And what that requires them to do then is for the city and the developer to go back and do a longer environmental impact review. And I know there's a lot of cries of, you know, NIMBYism, but those are real tools that can be used. Sure, they're used by developers that are, you know, with big wallets, but, you know, they're tools for the little David and Goliath, you know, battles sometimes, and that those are some of the other channels that you can do to address community and cultural displacement by really engendering maximal feasible participation of those people that are threatened in communities.
yeah, Denise?
One of the things that I'd like to sort of highlight, which is not nearly as planning oriented, is the role or the potential role that historic preservation neighborhood groups can actually play in this process of including their neighbors who may not believe in the same cosmology as the preservationists do, to include them in more activities at the local level. Some of the stuff that Juliana has mentioned to me over time really does kind of involve the charm offensive, where neighbors may ask, what color should I paint my house? This is your neighbor. And actually be reaching out for some kind of advice, knowing that their cultural values are different from the gentrifiers, from the preservationists. And I kind of would like to see more of that activity. I saw quite a bit of it. I think citywide and neighborhood preservation groups have a tremendous role to play by including people who may not be the same class or the same ethnicity to participate in activities that, after all, celebrate the history of the community, which doesn't happen to be just the gentry. So I would like to say that I think the most positive signs I've seen are with preservation groups who are really trying to work hard to reach out and be inclusive, even if, you know, people really do want to stucco their house, which is.
Well, one of the things that I really appreciate about historic neighborhoods is that they are neighborhoods. It's not just the way they look, it's that people really do know their neighbors. You have much stronger social connections in historic districts than you do outside of historic districts. So I think that's one thing that preservationists have done very, very successfully, is creating livable places where people can work, walk, play. You know, people watch their kids, they're neighbors. This is, again, going back to maybe the 40s and the 50s, the kinds of neighborhoods I grew up in that I don't see as I go about my travels, where people are pretty much stuck in their homes watching television, or they've got their nose glued to a cell phone. That it really provides for a lot more social interaction, and I think that's one of the positive things about historic districts. I'm going to throw a last question, well, a couple of additional questions here. We're starting to talk about how can preservation be part of the solution to gentrification and displacement. Anybody want to start on this?
Did you want to have time for questions?
Oh, we have another half hour.
Okay.
I'm watching it. Yeah, the audience participation part is coming up shortly, so have your questions formulated. If you haven't been like us, have them blow out of your brain. So how can preservation become part of this solution? The governor, as you know, has signed a bill that is allowing individuals to add accessory dwelling units by right if they are within, I think it's a mile of public transit, and that would include bus lines or mass transit. So what this basically means is that this is overriding local jurisdiction about what can happen in residential neighborhoods. You just get to do it. And there are parameters on the size of what can be done. You can either convert existing space within your home, or you can take an accessory unit and build it or convert an accessory unit. And this is, I think most people are in favor of what we would euphemistically call a granny flat. Certainly Airbnb has captured this interest for the last several years. A lot of people are already renting out rooms, maybe a few times a month, not permanently. But this is one way to increase affordable housing quickly by involving a number of small actors. The issue is, what does that do to historic districts? So there will be no CEQA review on this. Localities are able to write their own regulations on how this pertains to historic districts. CPF is actually looking at doing a model ordinance that we can share with communities up and down the state where this will become an issue. So I think, Juliana, you had some ideas about the pitfalls of this.
Well, Pasadena's been grappling with that issue. And when the first, Pasadena, the first time when it had to develop some standards for for accessory dwelling units, it was based on square footage of a property. So if you had 15,000 square feet or more, then you could do another unit. So now the question is, do we want to revise that ordinance, or to meet state law, we're going to have to do something? But there are a number of questions. Again, it becomes very complicated. If the idea is to increase affordable housing, I guess if you increase the number of units anywhere, you're going to increase some affordable housing. But are those units that are going to be new, are they going to be affordable? Well, they're not going to be affordable unless you have rent control. You have some way to control it. So what Pasadena had been proposing, that the homeowner, so there's some of the restrictions was that the homeowner has to live on site. Well, right now you can rent out a house. You know, you don't have to tell the government who's living in your house, right? You don't. There's no record of who the property, if the property owner is actually living on site at a certain property. So how are they going to maintain that? How are they going to enforce that? And then in terms of historic preservation, in a lower density neighborhood, all of a sudden, I always think like a planner, like if you allow one person to do that, imagine that everybody wants to, equal protection under the law. They all want to be able to enjoy the benefits of the law. So that means that every single property in Pasadena, you could add a unit. That means that the population could at least double, right? So if you go from 145,000 people, all of a sudden you have 300,000 people in less than a generation. Are you going to have enough fire protection? You have water? Is there enough water? Are there enough schools? It becomes, a bigger issue than just saying people can add another unit onto their garage. In terms of historic preservation, we have a conservation plan. All the 23, I think now, districts in Pasadena that are historic residential districts, they have conservation plans, and most of them, they're based on our neighborhood, on Bungalow Heaven, that says that what's regulated is what's visible from the public right-of-way. All of a sudden, if you're adding a second story to your garage, are you going to have to go back and change all of that? Are you going to have to change review? How are you going to possibly monitor all of this and all of the change? Another thing, Pasadena was questioning whether, if they allow these accessory dwelling units, if you would waive the requirement of having on-site parking, right? So they said if you live within 500 feet of a transit stop, well, every property in Pasadena, pretty much, except if you're way up in the hills, is within 500 feet of a transit stop. So it means that there is no accommodation. There's no need to look at how many more cars. And then the idea that people are going to give up their cars, I don't think so, not in California, not yet. I wish they would, but are they going to, if you're going to add a dwelling unit and there's no regulation on the number of people, because a family could be 10 people living in a dwelling unit. There's no regulation for that. So are you going to have another 5 cars per unit? Are you going to have another 2? Even another 2, where are you going to put the cars? So there's a lot of really, really big questions when it comes to this. It's no longer just the idea was a granny flat where your aging parent could live on your property. Well, you can do that anyway, with a microwave and a refrigerator, you have another dwelling unit, right? But this is more about commercialization of another unit, having a unit where people are living there that aren't part of your family, which is not in itself a bad thing, but how do you accommodate that kind of growth in any city? What are we going to do about that? All of a sudden, we're going to double the population.
Jim?
So there's the questions.
Yeah, I like to comment on that idea in a slightly different way. This idea that preservation has to deal with these kind of trends towards higher density, right? And that now that kind of expresses its way in a certain way in Pasadena, which is, well, single family homes, right? But that if you look elsewhere in Los Angeles, that the concern about affordable housing is pressing people towards higher density, especially on those, in those TOD zones. And, I think that preservation is increasingly going to have to contend with this. And even if preservation can't stop higher density, that, they may not be able to in certain neighborhoods because the pressures and forces for that are increasing, so that they can at least deal with kind of maybe the cultural side of, certain elements of historic and aesthetic preservation. And that with respect to that how they can best achieve that is these preservation groups. I think, many preservation groups are, if they were started in the 80s or 90s, the leaders of those preservation groups are getting older. They may have been many white middle class to begin with. They need to recruit new blood. They need to be socializing and grooming and mentoring, new blood, whether it's not only Anglo, but more racially diverse. I'm very interested in the concept of new urbanism. Sure, new urbanism, they made a lot of money off of high-end resorts in Florida, but it being located in Miami and Miami's Cayocho that they've done some very interesting things in ethnic communities, that new urbanism includes the idea that you preserve cultural heritage. But I think what new urbanism does is it couples high density with this idea of public and pedestrian space. And I saw a very interesting panel a couple nights ago at USC on vertical urbanism downtown, looking at the new Chinese and Korean investments going up in those very large skyscrapers. And I mean, that's high density in the opposite direction and kind of horrors for preservationists in some sense. But I think that they've integrated partly through city requirements, open space, public space, and even green space at this kind of 7th and 8th store podium level. It's amazing what's being planned down there right across from Staples Center at the Oceanwide Plaza and the Metropolis. And, you know, I think new urbanism works best, you know, in, you know, less vertical communities. But I think that, you know, preservation is going to have to contend with a changing city. And, you know, there were groups back in the 80s. One of the preservationists I spoke with said she got some training from a group called Not Yet New York. Well, seems like New York's kind of arrived, you know, at least downtown in some parts of LA.
Well, some of the largest new urbanist projects have been built in Pasadena. It's just that they've been built in the core of Pasadena, old Pasadena. There's actually a new project going in that's a 22-acre site in old Pasadena that's going to have 400 plus housing units and about 600,000 square feet of office and then some retail. But there are some very, very large. The Westgate project got the prize from the Congress for New Urbanism for its design. It was Stefanos Palazoides that worked on that. And physically, you know, new urbanism is driven by architects. It's an architectural physical form. It's walkable streets. It's having eyes on the street, all those kinds of things. It's not necessarily the social piece, because you have to have rent control or some kind of mechanism to make sure that those units are affordable. And that's the difficulty. Even in Pasadena, we have an in lieu fee. When developers develop, they have to pay a piece of that that goes into a fund to build affordable units. It doesn't mean that those affordable units are necessarily going to be in the same place. So then we're ghettoizing again. We have areas where they're lower income because that's where those units are being built, instead of being integrated into projects. So it's again, it's a difficult kind of a situation. And it's not just, you know, the physical form of those new developments, but it's the social piece of how you make them so people can live there.
Okay, last question, then we're going to go to the audience. Or last comment. Go ahead.
I just want to comment on the granny flats, because I absolutely recognize all the problems and issues that Juliana mentioned, but I'm not so ready to discard the option, because I definitely feel that they give certain options to people. I think we have to look into good examples. The city of Vancouver, another very unaffordable city, they actually had a public ballot, and overwhelmingly the citizens wanted these second units. We can regulate them. The other thing I know from colleagues from UCLA and Berkeley, that they're estimating there are a lot of unpermitted units, and I would rather have them permitted and into code than unpermitted. And also the fact that because of their scale, you know, garages, and a lot of the garages are in the back in Pasadena, small, they do tend to be quite more affordable. You find a lot of students, there are small 1, 2, or 3 people usually, although, you know, I can understand that there may be issues. So I'm much more in favor of really exploring this possibility and regulating it, because I think it does open up, it does make housing more affordable. And when you have housing more affordable, this is a good thing.
Okay, well, let's give a round of applause for our panelists. And now this is the audience participation part of the program. I'm sure you all have tons of comments or questions. John, how are we handling this?
Okay, so there's going to be some people online as well. There's about 14 of them, 21 now? No, 14. So if they have any questions, I'll field those.
Okay.
But first we'll start with people in the room. And Barbara, where's Barbara? Is she still in? Oh, maybe I'll just pass around the mic.
We're talking about having a stand and having people come to the stand?
I'll just pass around the mic.
All right.
It'll be easy. Okay.
Thank you very much. I don't have a question. I just want a recommendation. There's an article in Clinton, and I think the title of it is "Real Cause of Gentrification." And his argument deals with how the racial in Oakland, we're not on a 25-year gentrification. Hyper quick. You have Google buses, we have Tesla buses, which are have moved into the neighborhood in the last couple of years. But it's a really fast pace that it's going on. And it just in brief, is how these exclusionary zoning law then in areas like Rockbridge, Temescal, and so forth prevent apartments from being built. The small units, middling, the 6 or 12 unit apartment buildings have been outlawed for about a century. That's forcing these what referred as the techie scum, to move into West Oakland and elsewhere.
That's really expensive.
Anyhow, but I just came out this month. Oh, thanks.
Okay, and please hold the microphone closer to your mouth because these are picking up very lightly.
Hi, I am Liz Leshin with the Los Angeles Conservancy, and I would ask the panel if there are any neighborhoods that you feel are doing a great job down here in terms, or good or great job in terms of balancing these issues.
Wait. To ask me, say your question again. I was somewhere else. I'm sorry.
I'm wondering if any neighborhoods in Los Angeles are doing a good, decent job of dealing with these issues.
Do you think?
Oh, they're doing a good job
or
of
a
dealing
great job of balancing
of balancing.
these issues?
Gosh, in Los Angeles in general, that's a big question. That's an it depends one too. No, I mean, we're in a capitalist economy. Unfortunately, we have very little places. I mean, I don't know. Do you know of any places? Maybe Santa Monica at one time had rent control. Does any city of the 88 cities in Los Angeles County, does anybody have rent control? I don't think so. 4? 4, okay, good. So there are 4 places. Pardon me? Okay, all right. So yes, so then they're doing a fairly good job. So if you want to have any kind of affordability, you have to be able to control rents. And that kind of goes against, the American way of life, where you can't prevent anybody. So we talk about gentrification neighborhoods where people are selling out, right? You can't prevent anybody from selling their house to a willing buyer. It doesn't matter, foreign or domestic. We don't have any laws like that. If we were in China, we could have, more control because China, the country owns the property. It doesn't own the houses that are on the property, but it does own the property. But once you have property rights and you're in a capitalist economy, unless you have people that are very moral and very fair-minded and don't really want to make a lot of money and they don't have greed and all those kinds of things, it's going to be really difficult. I mean, that's my take on it.
Can I just make an observation? This is not from an economic point of view of controlling rents, but my observation in looking at the 5 cities that I did, which is by far not a random sample, the cities really do differ tremendously in the way in which they apply historic preservation laws and regulations. You have some cities that are real nitpicky, and you have other cities that go, yeah, sure, close enough. So, I don't know if that makes it better or worse, and I'm talking from more of an experiential point of view. I kind of think where in cities where it's a little looser, people are a little bit happier. Just because I think that their needs, the people who purists as preservationists are being recognized and accommodated. And as an anthropologist, I have to say, you know, that I respect that. I think people can all live together if you're a little bit more relaxed about, you know, how you interpret the regulations.
Other questions? John? We have, oh, Barbara's hand up. Okay. Can you hear me? Hi, Louisa Van Leer with the Highland Park Heritage Trust. We're a nonprofit in the Highland Park HPOZ. I'm a little surprised. I'm hearing a lot about single-family housing in this conversation, which is, of course, a lot of our housing stock in the city, and augmenting single-family housing with ADUs. And then a bit of a rejection of the larger density of the, say, the transit villages. What about methodology to allow 4-unit buildings to be built more effectively in historic districts? 4-unit buildings, these medium-sized buildings can add quite a bit of housing stock without changing fundamentally the fabric of the community. They can be inserted relatively easily. However, zoning laws do not currently permit that sort of. What do you think about medium density and state laws about that? Medium density AD.
Well, Pasadena just revised its general plan, and it has specific plan areas. And along the commercial corridors like Lake Avenue, Colorado, you know the bigger boulevards, there is an allowance to have higher density. There is always some kind of fear of that. I mean, we worked in Arcadia also, where I've worked in a lot of communities where there's this fear of density that somehow it's going to look like New York. So you have to show them, you have to take them by the hand and say, all right, this is what it could look like, and it can look really good, and it's not so scary, and it's not 8 stories, it's not 40 stories. All right, so there's a lot of public education that has to go into it, but a lot of cities do allow higher density along their cores, their commercial cores. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there was a small lot ordinance passed 3 or 4 years ago, right? That addresses part of what you're saying, that they take one lot and can put up to 3 or 4 units, sometimes more if it's a larger lot, right in Highland Park. Very cutting edge architectural design company, Modatif, is putting up a 3 units on what was previously just a single family bungalow lot. And they have to do some very inventive things with putting the parking at ground level and then, 2 or 3 stories residential on top. And it's all very kind of aimed at, quote, artists, the creative economy. It's going on in Silver Lake and other places. And I noticed at least that company and some others, they're very cutting edge, very aimed at the young, millennial, and with very, with the higher density, 1 or 2 buildings, one called Formosa Fusion, the other called, Bente Box, and I don't know if they're aimed at Asians, but, but, clearly we have some very innovative architects, and, and then whether it resolves, well, it resolves that need for higher density housing, but then there are some claims that some of these buildings look a little like mini multiple mansions in the neighborhoods that they're in, and then others claiming that they're really aimed at that higher income, upmarket, so that they're not resolving the affordable housing.
And those are essentially single-family houses crammed onto a lot, and there's been a lot of pushback in communities, and particularly in historic preservation overlay zones, that this was sold as a tool to increase density, but instead it's been a tool to increase bulk. And so you have these very bulky buildings. I'm talking about old school 4-unit apartment buildings
and the square footage of a single family house are a little bit more than a single family house. You know, these are buildings that could be tucked into typical 50 by 100-foot square lots if parking allowances were allowed. So, you know, they look like slightly larger single family homes, and they could be inserted and our rental property
Actually, I want to
specifically.
say that I very much agree with you. Oftentimes the zoning in cities prevents that, and there is something that some people started talking, some scholars, about graduated density zoning, where, you know, kind of incentivize owners of adjacent lots, if they want to develop their property, to come together and join their lots and allow them to build these, exactly what you're saying. Some cities are private, but not
John, do
LA.
we have anybody from online? Okay, I guess we're doing a good job of addressing all the issues. One question, all right. What first speaker? I think it was an article.
Oh,
Can somebody read that in the mic, please?
the real cause of gentrification? It's the, what was it? Oakland Magazine. Oakland, an article in Oakland Magazine.
Okay, back to the audience.
Christopher, City of Palm Beach. My question for the panel is about sort of communications, and if there's any thoughts about how these conversations be had more effectively between policymakers and communities. And I think for those of us that work as planners and preservation, we can disagree on the solutions, but we know that there has to be more supply. There has to be more housing supply in our cities, and we have a lot of empty lots, parking lots, underutilized commercial structures outside. But you go to a preservation group and to have that discussion, and any discussion, growth and redevelopment is really hard. And yelling at you about gentrification at this time. So how do you divide it? How, just from a communication standpoint, can you have some more effective discussions that lead to actual solutions?
Well, I know the Planning Congress, I'm the president of the Southern California Planning Congress. We've had a lot of discussions about that. We've had public programs. And just from my years, I mean, I don't mean to be cynical, but from my years of working in the, in the public sector and being on so many boards and commissions, you can only do so much to get people involved. And usually people react, when they see the plans and they don't like it, maybe they'll show up. But the proactive ones, I mean, I don't know. If anybody has an idea of how to get people, we tried everything. I was the chair of the general plan update advisory committee, and we tried every kind of way to get people involved, right? I mean, we gave away food, we had parties, we had neighborhood, every tactic. I mean, I hosted things in my backyard, so did my neighbors, people all across the city did that. But the turnout was actually relatively quite small. 15,000 people actually participated in a city of 147,000 people. What do? I don't know. Maybe I used to say, I think we need to have a really creative TV producer that does a show, and they have some, very popular, couple that lives in downtown LA, and they're not like, they're not like single. They have like children, and they work downtown, they ride a bike, and so we have some idea of what an alternate kind of lifestyle looks like. But until we have that, it's sort of more of the same. I don't know how you get people to participate.
Can I say, and of course it may sound very idealistic, but I think that we really need to try to go where people are and not always expect that they are going to come to the planning departments. And so years ago, we worked with Pico Union, a neighborhood. It was part of the Los Angeles Lani neighborhood initiative, and we had $500,000 Lani had for street level improvements and urban design improvements. And we said, okay, let's have a meeting. We was working at UCLA, let's have it at UCLA. Well, of course, no one showed up. That was a big mistake. Let's have it at the council offices. No one showed up. But when we started thinking where exactly the people are, there was a big Catholic church, St. Thomas Church, that was having 6 masses a day, Saturday and Sunday. and we talked to the priest, and he hosted a meeting there. There is the Normandy Recreation Center where a lot of kids and their parents go for soccer. So we had much better success in trying to go to communities. Now, of course, you will call me idealistic. I work in a university. I'm not in the public sector. I can afford to do that. But I think we really need to think about some venues. What are the groups that we can approach? It could be PTAs, the parent-teacher associations. It could be church groups. It could be neighborhood watch groups, and really find where they are. That's my...
If I can piggyback on this, are any of you familiar with a book that came out several years ago now called Bowling Alone?
Yes.
I'm sure all the panelists are familiar with it. But the premise of the book was, was there a golden age in America where we were more social and had more community organizations and were more connected as a culture and more sort of, it was easier to get consensus on issues. And the sociologists took a look at group participation in all sorts of organizations and concluded after doing a lot of number crunching, that in our current culture, our current society, we have really fragmented into little individuals. We may be connected on social media, but we never leave our houses or our cars, and we don't want to be bothered. So my experience in trying to run public meetings, I've had this frustration with the city of San Diego where I live. All the public meetings involving land use issues happen during the day downtown. Well, if you're an architect or developer and you're paid to go to those meetings, you'll show up. If you're a community member, there's no way you're going to do it. You got a job, you got kids you got to take care of, you got stuff to do, and parking's super expensive. So it's like, it's a non-starter. People don't go. So this issue came up at an APA conference where they had a young man who had become the social media director for Eric Garcetti when he became mayor of Los Angeles. And he was talking about how he was trying to get the public linked into City Hall with their cell phones. And this is where it really took a millennial who understands the technology and the way it's being used by a younger public to make that connection. So to piggyback on some of the comments of the panelists, we need to go where people are, and they're on their cell phones. So, I think the social media stuff is probably a better way if you can give people surveys or interactive chat rooms or something where they can do it on their time at their convenience. You'll get responses, but expecting them to show up in person when you've called a meeting is futile. Ain't gonna happen. Okay, well, I think we're just about ready. We're out of time. 3 minutes. Okay, one last question.
Well, can you hear me? I guess I'm on. I'm from Monterey, California, and I'm a member of the Historical Preservation Commission. And we're doing pretty well with Mills Act. We have a wonderful number of adobes people have cared about for a long time. A lot of things are really pretty good. But the area that I would like to see more help in, and perhaps you've been dealing with these issues, is now we find we have 400 or so homeless women in our area. So how are we going to put them into houses? And then people are trying to put them into some kind of living situations, but they're blocked by a lot of ordinances that say, well, you're 200 square feet, your lot's 200 square feet too small for a granny unit that could accommodate one of these people who often could fit in very well to that type of setting. And I'm in favor of kind of mixed neighborhood types of things where we do take care of our own people at different stages of life and sometimes mobility. So I'm wondering if those issues also are part of the gentrification, affordability, and then we have population groups that also need to be included in these types of small, neat units that could be part of a house or could be part of a larger project.
Is that a question?
Any comment from the panel?
Well, yeah, it's true. There are a lot of groups that are excluded from the whole array of what society has to offer, which is really, it's terrible. It's terrible in this country that you have people living in poverty or you have people living in the street. The homeless issue is just unconscionable. How you deal with it, again, it's a larger kind of problem. So if you're dealing with, I know with homeless issues, you have to have social services that go with it. You have to have medical care. You have to have, you know, and we used to have more. I mean, in the pre-Reagan era, we had halfway houses where people, when they were released from mental institutions, they had places to go in neighborhoods. We don't have it anymore. So it takes sort of the will of the people, right, to help make these things happen. Nobody, you know, except those four cities are imposing rent control. You know, no. You know, people that own apartment buildings because they want the income from it, they don't want the rents to diminish. So it's a very difficult situation. And we need more housing. We need more affordable housing. We need more housing for people who can't function in this society, and they need shelter. We need basic shelter. You know, there was the ordinances, the two that were just passed in the city of LA and the county of Los Angeles, and they're going to build 10,000 units. Well, we've got, and on any given night, there's what, 80,000 people living on the street. So it's a drop in the bucket. And a lot of those people are, they're not employable. They need a whole host of social services to even get off the street. Boy, I mean, you know, if you want to dedicate your life to it, I sure would, you know. I mean, I don't know what you do, so.
Well, I think we've come full circle here with looking at the issues behind gentrification, the wider societal issues. I hope you found this discussion enlightening, informative. As you can tell, we're just part of a network of issues that are cultural and of our time, and go forth with your good work. But remember, preservation isn't the only problem to affordability. We're just a piece of a much larger puzzle. Thank you for attending and enjoy the conference.